Hi, my name is Brendon. I'll be basically going through a series of 10 common mistakes that debaters make and how to avoid them. I guess it's important to start discussing sort of the motivation behind this seminar. The first is sort of reflecting on the question of what we can learn from judging. We're often told that it's super helpful for our debating, but the reasons as to why is often not so obvious. I think there are many things you can learn from judging, but I think the biggest and most important opportunity that people tend to neglect is the fact that when you're judging debates, you get to see other teams and see where they're debating. And it's beneficial then to be learning from the mistakes that debaters make and how you could potentially avoid them yourself. And I think that's for the very simple reason that often it's easier to learn from other people's mistakes, as opposed to your own, where you don't have your ego, you're not in heat of the moment, you can see things from a more rational and objective perspective. The second thing to kind of emphasize, and this is going to be sort of a general theme or principle behind this lecture, so if you take anything away from this, take away this, is the idea that debating is a relative game of persuasion. And a lot of the mistakes I'm going to be going through is when teams fail to understand that. That is to say that they often prove things to be true, but what they don't realize is that what they need to prove is why their claims are more likely than the opposition's, or that they explain why their arguments are important, but don't explain why those arguments are more important than that of their opposition. So, I'm going to break this down into kind of 5 mistakes in case construction, and then 5 mistakes in responsive strategy. The first, and I think probably the most common mistake that I've been seeing in the past 2 weeks or so of tournaments that I've judged, is teams splitting the comparative when they're constructing arguments. I'm going to unpack what this means. But the first thing to kind of understand is that debates always compare 2 worlds. So even though there's one thing in the motion, debates are always a comparison between that one thing and an alternative. So in a policy motion, it's the debate or the policy in question compared to the default, which is the status quo, or an alternative policy if the opposition team chooses a counter model. In an analysis motion, it's the trend or norm or thing in the motion compared to the world without that trend or norm, which we call counterfactual. Teams, for the most part, seem to understand that. The problem is that when teams attempt to explain that, they tend to structure their arguments in this way. They say, well, first, why our world is good. Second, why their world is bad. So for example, if the topic was something like, there was one I watched recently about whether we should bail out banks or sell them out. I think a lot of teams I would see would be like, well, the first argument we're going to make is why bailouts are good, and then we'll explain why selling banks are bad. What is the problem with this type of structure? I think it's twofold. The first is that it fails to recognize that really you're not going to be able to prove that everything about your model is going to be good. Like, if the debate were to operate, there have to be things that your model will have benefits for, and also harms that benefit accrues. Which means that if you're just explaining why your world is good, you're not really engaging the comparative question, which is why your model is better than the set of things that the opposition model might be better at. And that's the second thing, which is that asking whether something is good or bad is actually quite hard to quantify. Like, if your first argument is why your world is good, it's probably because it's good for a set of reasons, right? Like, it results in a set of impacts that are desirable, or because it maps to a set of criteria that we would deem desirable. And it is far easier to communicate that if you just divide your argument by that set of criteria. So you could say, instead of explaining, for example, well, firstly, why our world is good, secondly, their world is bad. I think a better way of structuring this might be like, well, we think this debate is going to be about 3 things. So in the case of bailouts versus selling out banks, the first consideration is who gets out of economic crises faster, and the second is who gets out of economic crises without as much debt. So then your first argument would be why it is much easier to bail out a bank, that leads to far quicker economic recovery, and secondly, we'll explain why that leads to less costly economic recovery. In that sense, you've already established, 1, what you want to achieve, and secondly, you've recognized that the burden for each argument is to prove why your world achieves it better than the opposition. So I hope from that you kind of understand the problem with splitting the comparative, which is that when you say first why our world is good, second why their world is bad, you're not making 2 separate arguments. What you've done is taken one argument and split it in half, which makes it much harder for judges to actually credit just how comparative your arguments are, which makes it harder for them to follow, which makes it less likely that your contributions will be credited fairly. Cool. Mistake 2. More reasons means better proven. So the way I'm going to kind of, that obviously probably sounds a little counterintuitive to you from start. So the way I'm going to kind of explain this is by going through a case study. So let's say, we're listening to the affirmative team on the topic that we would ban guns. Let's say they make the argument that, like this. So they say, well, less guns is good because less guns means less people die because most people accidentally use guns, not in self-defense, but through accidents and self-harm. Secondly, less guns means less crime. Thirdly, less guns means people are less fearful and therefore are more likely to feel safe. And that leads to a set of benefits, namely that less people die, less people are harmed by crime, so on and so forth. So this team has provided at least 3 reasons to explain why it's true and it's important. Is this, however, a claim that is fully proven? No? Why is this argument not proven? I hear Gus, you shook your head.
Yeah, but I'm thinking I'm doing chem work.
That's not good. Lucky.
I have low thoughts, apologies.
That's all good. Well,
I guess the thought is like, what is it? How people actually use guns and the clarity, but also of the alternative in that can people still use them and access them in other ways as well?
Well, yeah, perfect, right? Because we've kind of skipped the premise when we've made this argument. Essentially, this argument is just a series of reasons for why less guns is a good thing. But you've missed the link, which is explaining why a ban would lead to less guns. Because famously, if you ban things, it doesn't necessarily mean people can't access them. They might be able to go to the black market. So the reason why this argument is incomplete, even though there's a lot of reasons for it, is because those reasons have not fulfilled all the burdens requisite for that argument to be proven. And that's the problem, is that teams conflate the number of reasons that they provide with the number of burdens that are fulfilled. And what that means is that teams often excessively prove one premise, but unfortunately at the cost of missing others entirely. And the reason why you would much rather less reasons but more breadth in terms of premises proven is obviously because the overall strength or rigor or persuasiveness of an argument is just dictated by its weakest link. So let's say you've proven every single reason for why less guns are good. You're going to be defeated by one response if the other team points out you haven't even explained why you get less guns in the first place. So, in light of that, I think a solution or a potential way of avoiding this mistake is threefold. The first thing you'll have to ask yourself is, are your reasons even different? Because the number of times I've heard teams say that they have 5 reasons for things, the vast majority of the time, they're not 5 distinct reasons. They're like 3 of them are the same, but just applied to a different context. At which point, it's unclear whether separating those reasons out is even worthwhile. But secondly, even if those reasons are different, you have to ask yourself, do those reasons actually meet the burden that it intends to prove? Which is to say that you can give many reasons just why guns are bad, but that might not necessarily be useful if you need to prove that you need to reduce guns in the first place. And lastly, you have to ask yourself, what is the marginal value of the additional reason? Because remember, the only reason why we have multiple reasons for one premise is because it's a sort of insurance policy. You're not sure, maybe the opposition can rebut the first reason, the second reason, that's why you have the third reason, which is a backup. But the more reasons you provide, there are increasingly diminishing returns to insulating that one premise if it means that you have less time to insulate all the other premises. So, more reasons does not mean better proof. Cool. Mistake number 3, not explaining the difference or the delta, but I don't like that word. You should probably not use it because it's sort of jargony and it doesn't quite, it's just hard to access. You can just say difference, same thing. Cool. The kind of thing to understand is that when you're making impacts or arguing for impacts in debating, they're either unique or marginal. So a unique impact is you're creating something that hasn't existed in the world before, therefore it's unique, or it's marginal. So for example, if people already have money, but potentially your benefit is just giving people more money. The problem though is that for the vast majority of impacts, they're going to be marginal. It's very unlikely in debating you'll ever do something that no one has done before that is truly unique. And the problem with not recognizing that is that then most teams don't explain what is meaningfully different about their contribution. So they say, well, we give people money, and then the other team goes, well, we give people money in all these other ways. And therefore, your argument is likely to be very vulnerable to symmetry responses, where they say, well, this benefit has already been achieved, or it's going to be vulnerable to tipping point problems. So other team goes, well, you're trying to give money to make people, do this. So for any subsidy debate, you're trying to subsidize people in order to get to a desirable outcome. Like, for example, subsidizing people to work in industries that are currently scarce. Other teams might go like, well, we already have subsidies for all these other things, and it's not clear that even those other things exist, that still hasn't led to people reaching that behavior. So, what is the solution to this? I think what teams need to recognize more is just asking yourself, what is different about your impact? And then secondly, why that difference is significant. What is unique to the thing that you are supporting, particular to this motion? So let's say, for example, you're supporting a tax. Obviously, the government has already a huge plethora of taxes that they already do, which means that you're not going to be, it's not a very good or comparative impact to just explain, well, this gives the government more money. The government has plenty of money. But what's specifically about the allocation of this tax, upon whom this tax is levied, how enforceable this tax might be, those are things that are unique and particular to you and are not claimable by any other team in the debate. So, let's kind of work through a case study here. So, this is kind of a classic topic that we would not give development aid to dictatorships. A sort of problem that affirmative teams run into this debate is when the negative team goes, what about humanitarian aid, right? Because there's a distinction between development aid, which is for long-term economic growth, compared to humanitarian aid, which is more short-term, more responsive to immediate crises and things like that. What is unique about development aid, which means potentially it is worse and we should not give them to dictatorships, even if we are still happy to provide them with humanitarian aid? Does anyone have any ideas? Ben, you might have an idea.
Is it easier to repurpose for nefarious things?
Yeah, very good. So you can explain that, well, what's unique about development aid is that because it is inherently for long-term projects, necessarily it is far it's far harder to hold that money to account because you don't know whether it's going to be paying off until 5 or 10 years down the line. Whereas humanitarian aid, it's for quite immediate things which are far more visible, therefore corruption is much more likely. Yeah.
I don't know, well, my thoughts when I see this is just like, does it potentially make the dictatorship less reliant on the population and thus more capable in abusing that population?
Yeah, that's another thing, right? But that's good, right? Because the thing that but kind of what specifically about development aid doesn't mean that it's less reliant on people?
Because it's probably going to be, or that you probably have to tax your people less and have to worry less about their income and their production.
Is that different from the other types of aid?
With humanitarian, where is it? Potentially not, which is part of the problem.
Yeah, exactly. But it's worth kind of having these thoughts in the first place, right? Because at the end of the day, you want to make sure that the negative team can't, or the opposition team can't symmetrize everything. They can be like, well, we can claim that too, we can claim that as well. What you need to find is the one thing that is unique to your side, and then explain why that difference is significant. Cool. Mistake number 4, skipping the first premise. What I mean by this is that most debates are about changing people's behavior, but the problem is that a lot of the time teams don't analyze the reasons behind why people are doing the things that we want to change in the first place. And that first premise can have significant downstream effects on the rest of the debate. So this is quite a wordy motion, but it's pretty much it's a motion that I had this idea about the mistake for. Essentially, the motion is just like the IMF gives loans to countries, and it's whether the conditions on those loans are good or bad. And in that debate, there's this intense back and forth about which teams about, oh, this specific condition might be good, or maybe this specific condition might be bad. But it is only like one team out of the 4 teams in that debate that just asked a simple question. Well, why do these countries accept loans? And there are 2 plausible characterizations for this. If it is the case that countries are taking onto loans because they thought about the loan and they thought, well, that loan probably works well for me, and they consented to that loan, then it probably is the case that the loan is a good thing for that country. If it's the case that the country was sort of coerced into taking the loan, like they were desperate, there was huge pressure on them to take the loan, they were kind of strong-armed into it by the international community, then that characterization would suggest that those loans are not necessarily made in the economic interests of those nations. So, the first premise in this debate, which is just why do countries sign to loans, can have very radical implications for almost every other impact in this debate. Because almost every other impact is contingent on why exactly countries are opting into loans and whether they can opt into, well, I'll give another example of this. So there's a kind of classic debate about whether we should send children to prison. And in most of those debates, or most of the time when teams debate that motion, we go into the principle, like is it fair to send kids to prison? You know, what does the conditions of these prisons look like, et cetera, et cetera. But I think a pretty important question to ask when you're debating that motion is just asking yourself, well, why do children commit crimes? And the reason why that's important is because it essentially means once you diagnose the cause of that behavior, then that will obviously influence the solution to that problem. So, if it is the case that, for example, kids commit crimes because they're coming from kind of backgrounds where they don't have a lot of money and they're mainly committing crimes out of circumstance, they're committing crimes of theft, then prison's probably not a very good idea for those children because those children aren't committing crimes for any social defect, they're committing crimes out of material paucity, in which case prison will be a very poor suit for them. But if it is the case that we are talking about children that have displayed quite violent behavior, quite antisocial behavior, then in those settings, prison might be more accommodating. So can we see how almost every other impact in this debate is really just contingent on the initial characterization of why do children commit crimes, and the various contexts in which that plays out has very drastic implications for the rest of the debate. Cool. Mistake number 5, copy-pasting arguments. I want to kind of start with a brief caveat here, which is that it's totally fine to repurpose analysis from other debates if it is relevant. You know, most debates on, like, I would say pretty much most motions are just reskinned versions of like 20 fundamental clashes or debates. So obviously there's going to be a lot of crossover. The problem is that it's not sufficient to merely replicate. Why is that the case? It's because obviously, you know, debates are, you know, most debates you probably recognize the core clashes, like is it about individuals' freedom over social good? Is it whether we would prefer rehabilitation or whether we would prefer some kind of deterrence? But there is always going to be something particular about the motion, which means that we need to specifically rework, readjust our arguments so that they specifically adhere to that. So, what could those differences be? The first could be contextual differences. This is actually quite important because often debates are place set in particular areas, particular contexts, which means that arguments are different. So, for example, there was a motion that I kind of judged last 2 days ago, actually, which is something about like investing significantly in sport in disprivileged communities. Obviously, the teams I watched sort of made general arguments about whether sport is good or bad, but very clearly the fact that it's place set in disprivileged communities also adds an additional layer or nuance to those arguments. So potentially, you know, sport is healthy or not, that sort of applies to pretty much any community, like the health benefits of sports, but potentially a very underanalyzed section of the debate, at least I watched, was about, you know, the effects of sport in terms of social cohesion. So I think there are decent arguments the affirmative team suggests that greater recruitment or greater participation in sports programs might be a very useful outlet for young people in those disprivileged communities when the comparative often, unfortunately in many cases, is some level of crime. So just considering where the debate is placed at adds an extra layer to the arguments, to the generic cookie cutter arguments you tend to run. The other differences are in comparatives or in burdens. So sometimes teams make arguments without realizing that the motion has actually explicitly identified a different comparative, which means that you have to kind of adjust it all. So for example, in topics about whether we should legalize drugs, sometimes teams make a basket of arguments about, like, for example, bodily autonomy and all those kinds of things. However, that is not going to be the case if the debate is instead phrased as that we would prefer the legalization of drugs to the decriminalization of drugs, because notably that the opposition team is not supporting the status quo in the second debate, presumably, which means that arguments like the principle are probably going to be much weaker when people still have access to drugs in some settings. So noting when comparative shift and how that impacts the arguments you typically run is also very important. And differences in burden, sort of the same thing, but in general, you want to look for specific differences in the wording of the motion and tailor your arguments accordingly. Cool. responsive strategy. Mistake number 6. This is probably the biggest problem that I've noticed when it comes to responses or errors that people make in responses. And that's that I've noticed a recent trend of teams, particularly in later sections of debate, just saying that we're winning because the other team's impacts are just totally unproven. There's a couple of problems with this. The first is that, I guess the first one is that it's almost impossible for a team's impacts to be entirely disproven or to be entirely incorrect. Like, it's very difficult in debating generally to prove things certainly one way or another. But the second and more crucial one is that just because another team is wrong doesn't actually necessarily mean that you're right. So for example, in debates that I've seen, typically the negative team just bashes the affirmative team and goes, well, your policy won't work at all. But just because a policy is not 100% effective, or indeed effective at all, does not mean that the policy is harmful. And what that means then is that opposition teams, or teams in general, need to not just explain why the other side doesn't work, they also need to explain why that side causes a harm, or why their solution is comparatively far more effective. Which is to say that it's not fair for you to impose burdens asymmetrically. You can't just say, well, if we prove that they can't get anything, that we automatically win. You also need to prove why yours is comparatively effective. So, what is the solution to this? It's very simple. Just when you make any response that you make, just think about why that response means your case is comparatively better. So instead of being like, well, they haven't proven anything, they haven't proven that, that's fine. What you want to say right afterwards is, by contrast, they haven't proven their argument, but we have proven our argument for a set of reasons. The second thing you want to ask yourself, though, is can this response be equally applied to our case? And this is a useful test for making sure whether your responses are charitable. So if you say, well, their characterization is totally assertive, ask yourself if you are just totally asserting your own characterization. If that is the case, you need to come up with better reasons than that. Cool. Mistake number 7. This is a particularly big bugbear. The problem with completely settling for mitigation is that mitigation, in theory, really can't ever win you a debate on its own. Because mitigation is just proving that another team's argument isn't true in that setting, and that setting. That at best reduces the chances of the other team winning that issue, but it doesn't boost your own chances of winning your own issue. But the second problem with over-relying on mitigation is that it's very hard to assess what I call a death by 1,000 cuts, which is just that if you provide a bajillion responses to explain what this argument's really mitigated, like it's probably not true in this setting, it's not that important in this other setting, it's probably symmetric in this other setting. It's very hard for most judges, I think, to sort of add all of that up and to quantify just how much this argument's persuasive value has been reduced. And also thirdly, I think teams often settle for mitigation without realizing that their arguments have also been extensively mitigated, which means that you often end up in debates where both teams have proven like extraordinarily marginal impacts either way. And those debates are very, very hard to judge. And often that means that debates go against the way you intended to. Yeah.
So oftentimes, say, a problem that I will have is that I just can't determine what else to do other than mitigation. So what tools would you use then to...
Yeah, perfect. That's a great question. So the first solution I had is to be more ambitious. So obviously mitigating is like one kind of response, but there are obviously many other responses you could go for. So I would say another thing you want to do is sort of disprove. So the way you want to go about that is just asking yourself, well, what are the burdens that this argument requires? And is there any point in that logical chain where it breaks entirely? So for example, instead of just being like, this argument says, oh, well, people will do it this way. Instead of being like, oh, well, no, sometimes some people won't do it that way, sometimes people will do it another way. Maybe the problem is that, well, people won't do it that way because they don't have the capacity to do it that way. And then you explain why people are incapable of doing that. Can we see how that response sort of cuts through any, and is far more effective than any kind of mitigation? Does that make sense? The other way you want to go about it is, you can always go for a flip. So what I mean by that is that you accept the other team's premise, but what you do is just you reject the conclusion. So you go like, well, it is true that people want this. However, it does not mean that this impact will happen. In fact, the fact that people want this means the impact won't happen, or in fact, the opposite of that impact will happen. So essentially, I think honestly, like, there are very few cases in debating where the only port of call is mitigation. I think the reason why people default to mitigation is I suspect sort of like a degree of risk aversion. So they go like, oh, I'm not sure this response will play out, but I'm probably pretty sure that I can mitigate in some settings, so I'll just default to mitigating. Just the question I have to ask yourself is like, what's the harm, right? Like, you go for a response, maybe it doesn't work, but you'll have plenty of other opportunities in your speech to launch other responses. And notably, if your response fails, then there's no real harm to you, right? It's just an opportunity cost, not a biggest thing in the world. But if your response does land, it's great, because rather than just whittling down the argument, you probably have a greater chance of just defeating the argument entirely, or flipping the argument. So, I would say in a risk versus reward calculus, it's in your interest most of the time to go for more ambitious plays and then have mitigation as your kind of response of last resort. The last thing I want to say is that if it is the case in a few circumstances, and this will probably happen, that mitigation is the only possible response, instead of just mitigating it and leaving it at that, you also want to explain at the end of your responses just how much the likelihood or significance of the comparative degree of the argument has been reduced. So in the same way that, for example, you would impact a substantive point, so at the end of it explain why it really matters, why this impact should be most important. You also want to be doing that with your rebuttals. You want to be like, well, given we have mitigated in this way, what you have to believe is that most people will not do this. Even if they did, most people will not do that. So the probability of this argument is vanishingly small. So doing the legwork for the adjudicator and explaining exactly how your mitigation is reduced to persuasive value, rather than leaving it up to the judge to piece them together for themselves, because often they will. Cool. Counter-asserting characterizations. There's a very common back and forth that happens in most debates. AF will say, well, people will not behave in X way, and the negative team will go like, oh no, people won't behave in X way. They will instead behave in Y way. What is the problem with this? The problem is that essentially what you're doing is that you're not directly responding to the other team's characterization. You're just counter-asserting your own characterization, but the problem is that both characterizations are equally plausible. So I'll give you an example of this. I judged a scrim recently, and there's a clash in that debate about, what the effect of jail is on people who leave prison. So I think the negative team in that debate said something like, well, prison's pretty bad. What it does is that it exposes you to a pretty alienating environment. It puts you in a situation with other very dangerous and traumatized people, and that leads to problems of organized crime and drug abuse, which means that, in fact, people leave prisons being more hardened criminals rather than reformed criminals. And then after that debate goes, well, that's silly. If prison was that bad, then you wouldn't want to go back to prison because prison was that violent and confronting. I think the problem is that both characterizations are plausible. There are a set of people that will probably leave prison being reformed, and there are a set of people who will leave prison being hardened. The question is not which characterization is true or not. Both are probably true. Its question is what characterization is more plausible or more probable, or what is a larger set of people that accounts for. So, what is the solution? It's to explain why Y is more likely than X. But I think the second way to go about it is that you assume the other team's characterization and you give an even if response. I think this is probably the best way to go about it, because at the end of the day, characterization debates, it's very hard to prove analytically. Most characterizations are rooted on some kind of intuition or essentially assertion about the world. So the far cleaner port of call is, rather than making the debate about a literal 50-50 about what characterization the adjudicator believes at the end of the day, I think the smarter way to go about it is to avoid the 50-50 altogether and go, well, look, we think our characterization is probably more correct, but even if you don't believe that, we'll just assume their characterization and still explain why we win on their terms. And I think the team that better does that is almost always the team that wins, because you just give it a very nice outlet for the adjudicator to justify the win without having to litigate a very, very contentious and often impossible to litigate clash. Cool. Mistake number 9. Symmetry is a double-edged sword. So, in the same way that mitigation can't ever play for an advantage because it's literally just reducing the probability of the other argument, symmetry responses can never play for an advantage because a symmetry response is just explaining nothing changes, right? Like, You don't get your benefit because it already happens, but at the same time, you don't get your harm either. And that's quite important, because often I think teams make a lot of responses about why things are symmetric, without realizing that if you symmetricize the other team's harm, you can often just symmetrize your own benefit. And that's quite bad, because it means that neither team really has an advantage, and it's unclear why you've essentially shot yourself in order to shoot the other team's impact. The very straightforward solution for this is that you always want to follow up a symmetry response with a response explaining why you are better in another way. So the typical way you want to go about this is you want to go, look, we think with respect to this harm on minorities, we think the unfortunate reality is that minorities are harmed in a host of other ways. This harm is symmetric. But we think that our benefit is actually unique, and therefore, on a comparative lens, we are far, far better. So that kind of makes sense. I think a symmetry response is always a part of a 1-2 punch. You want to neutralize the worst case of next harm, but you also want to play for a tiny advantage in some other setting, and to play for a margin bet. Lastly, critiquing an argument is not the same as rebutting it. I think these are quite of a bad problem of really just lazy debating, where you identify a problem with the other team's argument and you just leave it at that. So the classic example of this is, you get up and you go, well, the problem is this argument is totally absurd, and then you just move on as if that was enough. The problem with that is that response is literally assertive, like you're just asserting that the other team's argument is assertive. And also there's a plausibility problem to that, right? Like, think about it. If the other team has spent, 4 to 5 minutes backing up this claim, I don't think most judges would, even if it was true, that the argument was built on assertions, most judges typically don't feel confident in crediting like a 10-second response that you say about why it's bad because it's assertive. Most judges will not credit that response favorably. What that means then is that you need to be cognizant of the fact that responses follow the same burdens as a substantive argument. And indeed, in the same way, you structure an argument by explaining what the problem is, explaining how you solve the problem, and how you impact that problem, by solving that problem. You can borrow that structure for responses. So you can be like, well, what is the problem in the opposition's case? It's useful to identify it. But importantly, then you provide reasons for why that's a bad thing. So rather than just being like, well, the other team, they don't have a mechanism, go further than that, explain why, well, the team doesn't have a mechanism because in fact this argument's not true for a set of reasons. And then afterwards explain why that argument being not true is very devastating for the other team's case. So that's pretty much it for my 10 mistakes. Hopefully you've learned something in how to avoid them. I'm also happy to answer any questions. Nope, all good. Cheers.